lecture number 7, and still on Unit 3. This is theological trends and internal struggles. I think this is a really important part of the course. Remember that before we were talking about the sources of information and the distinctiveness, and now we're going to be talking about some of those early tensions or internal struggles. So I think it's very, very important, and I think it's true that you had theology sort of dictated some of the politics, but on the other hand, political positions also influenced the theology. So that's important to know. And we, of course, know about the Shiites. Everybody knows about them. In other words, if you know anything about Islam at all, you've studied about the Shiites. But that's not the only group, and we're going to be looking at several trends and schisms that took place. The Muslims have had a lot of I guess dissension and a lot of disagreements. But the Shiites, first of all, of which we know quite a bit about them, and that was really the first issue in the Ummah after Muhammad died. In the question, as we've said before, is who will be the legitimate successor? Who will be the caliph? And some admittedly said, well, the Prophet had really appointed Ali, his own son-in-law and cousin. So you got that double relationship to the Prophet. In other words, he had the Prophet's blood in his veins, but he was also married into the family. He married Muhammad's daughter. And they said that leadership in the community is too important to leave up to anybody, to ordinary men. And they were convinced that the only ones who are capable and qualified are those who are close to the Prophet. And so you see, they basically rejected the first three, didn't they, caliphs? They rejected Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman. They said that they were bogus. Really, the one that should have been chosen immediately after the Prophet was Ali, is what their contention is. But the Sunnis are the ones who really won out in the end. In other words, they're the dominant group. But Tabri, remember the historian and the commentator who died in 923, he says that after a stormy debate, the Saqifa assembly chose Abu Bakr as the first of 4 rightly guided caliphs. Now they were chosen, I guess, elected by ijma. Ijma meaning the consensus, you see. Well, why would they choose him? Well, he was the oldest, and he was sort of a respected fellow, as age, is very, very important. But there were some other reasons for it as well. As mentioned, he was the father of Aisha, and he had been a faithful companion and a trusted advisor of the Prophet. And I wanted to read one verse here out of 9 and verse 40, and this it gives you another reason why he was chosen. In other words, in the Quran in 9 and verse 40, it tells you that Abu Bakr had been the one who was with the Prophet when he fled Mecca. It says here that if you help not your leaders, it is no matter for Allah. Indeed, did indeed happen when the unbelievers drove him out. See, the Meccans drove him out. He had no more than one companion, and the 2 were in the cave. And he said to his companion, "Have no fear, for Allah is with us." Then Allah sent down his peace upon him and strengthened him with forces which you saw not. So, in other words, God protected Muhammad and Abu Bakr in the cave. They hid as they were being pursued, and the tradition says that a spider made a sort of a web over the mouth of the cave, and when his pursuers came along, they saw this and they said, well, obviously nobody has been in here. But the truth was that Muhammad and Abu Bakr were hiding in that cave, and so they escaped. So the argument goes that he was an older person, he was respected, he was the one that held the Muslims together, and he had traveled with the Prophet when they left Mecca and made their way to Medina. All right, now the Kharijites. This comes out of, if you're looking for sources, you could go to Glassé, Encyclopedia of the Quran. The Kharijites means separate. They were responsible for a third political trend. 25 years after Muhammad died, they rebelled against Ali. The reason is that Ali allowed arbitration in a dispute with the rebel Muawiyah. Remember that fellow Muawiyah? And the occasion was the Battle of Siffin, 657, and Muawiyah was the governor of Damascus, and he very slyly called for arbitration, when there was this dispute. Called for arbitration, and, they held up Qurans on the end of their swords, and so, as a result of that trickery, Ali's army split into two factions. You had the Kharijites, who were the separatists, and you had the loyalists. Undoubtedly, I think Ali made a mistake, because it cast doubt on his leadership. So the Kharijites and the Muslims had the right to depose or even to kill a caliph who was guilty of sin. Such a sin questioned even if he was a Muslim. Of course, the Shiites profoundly disagreed. So from a literal Quranic interpretation, they said that Ali's decision was not according to the book. So they opposed the Sunnis, who wanted the Khalifa to draw from a Meccan Quraysh, but they also opposed the Shiites, who wanted it reserved for Banu Hashim, that is, House of the Prophet. Historically, it's been a violent group, and only a few remain today in Algeria, Tunisia, Oman, and East Africa. So, here's the issue, that one ceases to be a Muslim, and you become a kafir when you make bad choices. Doesn't that sound a little bit like some of the things we've argued about in Christianity? If you fall into major sin, can you remain a Christian? This is some of the things that Christians have talked about. Now, let's go on to the Murji'ites. Again, Fakhri, page 13. These were ones who were more mild in their, decision. These were the quietists. These were the patient people. These were the ones who said, let's withhold judgment as to who is a Muslim and who isn't. Let God decide. They said that if prayer is led by an imam with a questionable character, it's still valid. It possibly seems that they were reacting to the Kharijites, who stated very definitely what sin is and what it isn't. They said God knows best. Let God be the judge. They said basically that only one pillar of the 5 pillars makes you a Muslim. That is profession. If you confess with your mouth Muhammad and the Quran, you see, this is the idea. And they said, well, we'll wait and see. In other words, profession is all we can go by. The iman, submission to God and love for God and so on. This is really the way you get in the door. I mean, again, I hope that repeating this isn't boring, but they've argued and fought over some of the things that we have also fought over. What makes you a Christian? Well, what makes you a Muslim? Now, the next, the Qadarites, or the Qadariya, it comes from the word Qadr, which helps us to remember the theology here. Qadr means power, and it are those who upheld the ability to choose. In other words, you have the power to choose. Don't get mixed up here on what the Qadarites believed and held to, because the ones really, the Jabarites, are quite different. Now, the Qadarites were those, this was rejected by those who were the Umayyads, because they said, that the Umayyads were heavy-handed. They were very influenced by predestination. And the Qadarites accused the heavy-handed Umayyad caliphs of being wrongly influenced by Greek philosophy. Now, I wanted to just read a few verses on, that will emphasize predestination. For example, 639. I wanted to say that in the Quran you can get both. Admittedly, the predestination seems to be predominant. There are a lot of verses on the predestined, God predetermined stuff. But there are a few, admittedly, on free will. Now, here is one on predestination. It says in 6 verse 39, those who reject our signs are deaf and dumb in the midst of darkness profound, whom Allah willeth, He leaves to wander. Whom He willeth, He places on the right path. Well, that's pretty much into predetermination, isn't it? Another one that's the same is 11 and 119. Except those on whom thy Lord hath bestowed His mercy, and for this did He create them. And the word of thy Lord shall be fulfilled. I will fill hell with jinns and with men altogether. Now we could look at other ones. There are lots of verses on that. But now we will go to verses on free will. You see, that's also in the book. So you can see that, there are both sides. Now, one that has to do with free will is 40 and verse 43. It talks about, without doubt do you call me to one who is not fit to be called, whether in this world or in the hereafter. Our return will be to Allah and the transgressors. That one, there's an indication there of free will in our choices. Another one is 41 and verse 40. Those who pervert the truth in our signs are not hidden from us, which is better, be that is cast in the fire. So that's onto free will as well. And then lastly, 53 and verse 32, those who avoid great sins and shameful deeds, only falling into smaller faults. Verily thy Lord is ample in forgiveness. So we won't go into the theology of that verse, but nevertheless it does give the idea of free will. You see, those were the Qadarites. They, in fact, I said more than just the Qadarite view there. I got into some other verses too on predestination, but I just wanted to give you some verses on both sides. But the Qadarites insist that people do have the power to make their own decisions. They're sort of the people who can choose. Now, here we go on those who are determinists. These are the Jabarites. These are, and according to Fakri, who was one source here, page 15, they're the determinists. And page 16. Of course, the Asherites are the same, but God alone has the power to choose and to act. He's the first one, you see, who makes the decision. No one acts from compulsion. Only God can act. Now, the Jabberites, it doesn't mean people who talk too much, jabber too much, but it's from the word majbur, you see, to force, or majburiya, majbura, led first by a caliph of the name of Jahm. And, you can see the type of theological hair splitting that's going on. And it is the present thrust of Islam. Denial of free will. God is absolutely sovereign. They're very, very strong on God's control. These are the Jabberites. Now, think about the Mutazilites. The Mutazilites are the rationalists. They're the ones who say, but there is not this, black and white issue at all. It's not that simple. They said that if they opposed the Kharijites, who said that if you commit a grave sin, you're finished. You're not a believer. You should be put to death. And Fakri says that this is the first articulate theological movement in Islam. They did have two schools, admittedly, but both schools emphasized that you do have a free will. You're capable of choice. And obviously they're at odds with the determinists, who had said that only God has the power to choose. Their goal is to counteract the Asherites, who, along with, Al-Ghazali, said that nothing in this universe happens without God's intervention. And so, as rationalists, the Mutazilites said the Quran is created and thus becomes the Word of God. So here you have a clear distinction here. These guys, they resort to reason and rationale over revelation. They affirm God's unity, as we've said before, and they, talk about God's justice and on and on, and reject anthropomorphisms. Now, lastly, let's go to the Asherites, and we'll finish the lecture with these. Faculty talks about these on page 67. This comes about in the 10th century, and Al-Ashri had been, interestingly enough, Al-Ashri had been a Mutazilite. But after a dream of Muhammad, he turns away from it. And he becomes on the opposite side. An amazing turnabout. So, this is the viewpoint. This is the theology that eventually wins out in the end. And this is known as Orthodox theology today. He really launches an assault against the Mutazilites and their many theologians. I think I might have misspoken here a few minutes ago in calling Al-Ghazali an Asherite. He wasn't. He was more of a Mutazilite. But it's sort of hard to track him down because Al-Ghazali had other things in his doctrine, like Sufism, that was not always well accepted either. But if you go to Al-Hazar today, it's the Orthodox stuff, the Asherites. So with that, we'll go on next time to the matter of law.